This is a Chapter 9 overview. Let's get started. Okay, so I want to start with some of the terms that are used in this chapter. Neighborhood, neighboring, and community. And as we go through these, I want you to consider where you live and whether you think these terms apply to where you live. A neighborhood is defined as any socio-spatial environment where primary relations such as intimacy among residents dominate. Okay, so essentially this is saying not intimacy such as, you live together, but you know your neighbors, you talk to them on a regular basis, you may invite each other over your houses, your children play together, that type of idea. My guess is that not a whole lot of you live in this kind of geographic area or neighborhood, although maybe you do. I think this is probably a less common type of neighborhood than it used to be. The neighboring. Neighboring is the social interaction and activities between neighbors that build this shared sense of community identity and occur across metropolitan regions. Okay, so again, thinking about how maybe for the 4th of July, maybe your neighborhood or your street had a block party. That used to be very common when I was a kid. Neighbors would all get together and have a block party, or having a garage sale that's advertised and all the families are participating on that particular block. Again, not so sure that a lot of that's happening in a lot of geographic areas where we live today, but it may. Just depends on the place. And then community, a group of interconnected people who have a shared sense of identity and commitments. And they may or may not be in that particular geographic space. So here we could think about something I think is more common today, a community, the LGBTQ community, people who have that shared sense of identity, who may be committed to certain social movements or certain social activities, who identify with one another, and they don't all live in the same place. Or people who are all Dodger fans or all Lakers fans, and they live across various parts of the metropolitan area of LA, but they have that shared sense of identity. And they may be very committed to that team. But by political parties, perhaps, or by other types of, Black Lives Matter movement, different types of organizations that people identify with, although they don't live in the same place. 3 dimensions of communities identified in 77 by this team, the Warrens: identity, interaction, and linkages. Identity, having a sense of connectedness to a place, whereas interaction is the strength and the frequency of interactions within that space. And then the linkages, what are the ties between the local area and the larger community? Based on these 3 characteristics, the Warrens identified 5 different kinds of neighborhoods. And as we go through this, I want you to consider whether you identify where you live as one of these neighborhoods. The parochial neighborhood, very strong subcultural orientation, dominates everyday life. It's a very stable community. It's got a strong identity, a lot of neighboring interaction. These might be communities that are perhaps religious communities, where people of a certain religion maybe all live in this very similar or nearby geographical area. However, people who live in urban areas tend to have weaker ties to the surrounding area. The integral neighborhood. This is a neighborhood that has all 3 dimensions, and there's a lot of active neighboring with a high degree of involvement in community associations. They've got strong ties to the city agencies and active influence in affairs of the city as a whole. This seems to me like it might be a good example of this would be a small town. A small town perhaps where everyone knows each other, their children go to school together, people work together at the same factory or the same industry. people go to similar, to church, similar churches, etc. It seems to me like smaller towns might more likely qualify as being integral neighborhoods. The diffuse neighborhood. This is a neighborhood that has very low levels of neighboring, so there's not a lot of identity or linkage going on there. There's not a lot of social networking among residents within the neighborhood. And so, well, there's low levels of neighboring, but there's a lot of interaction and social networking among residents with others outside of the neighborhood. So that may mean that while people within a community or geographic space don't have a lot of linkages with one another, they do outside of that space. And so, for example, people who may live in one geographical space, they don't spend a lot of time there necessarily because they go to work somewhere else, they go to school somewhere else, they hang out on their leisure time somewhere else, they vacation somewhere else or visit friends somewhere else, they go to gym somewhere else. So that would be more of a diffuse neighborhood. The anomic neighborhood, the Warrens argued this was very characteristic of many poorer areas. These areas tend to have lower voter turnout, weaker community organizations, not a whole lot of interaction or connectedness among the residents, and there may be high levels of social disorganization and crime. I want you to think about this. The next time you drive through, or if you live in a lower income area, I want you to look around to see if you ever notice any of those little signs that say Neighborhood Watch Program. My guess is you won't, because I used to live in LA for many years, and I used to teach at schools, high schools, for the college that I was working for. They had classes at the high schools, and never did I see any of these signs. However, in my own neighborhood, there was a community watch. I never participated in it, but there was a community watch organization. So that to me is an indicator that in lower income areas, people don't necessarily want to get involved in those types of community organizations. They don't want to be bothered by that. They don't have time for it. They don't want to feel as though they're reporting on neighbors, etc. Which of course then can lead to more crime because people aren't looking out for one another and more social disorganization. Stepping Stone neighborhood, this is a kind of neighborhood where people are living there only as long as it takes for them to get some resources to move somewhere else. So somebody who's living in an area because the apartment's very cheap and they're trying to save up some money maybe so they can move to a bigger apartment in a nicer area. They need that down payment, or they need the first month's rent, the security deposit, so they're living in this cheaper area, saving up money, and as soon as they get it, they're going to move to that nicer area. Or people who buy a home in a, quote, less desirable neighborhood with the idea that we'll build up some equity and then we'll sell this place and go to that other better neighborhood. And the defended neighborhood, this is a response from people within a neighborhood who believe or feel that there's some kind of external threat to their nice little community. And so they have a lot of community identity, increased social interaction as a community mobilizes to build those linkages to the local government. This is a perfect example of this is South Pasadena. In the mid-1970s, the state of California decided that it would be a great idea to extend the 710 from where it ends, near East LA, through the city and into Pasadena and South Pasadena. Well, it turns out the people in South Pasadena did not like that idea. They didn't want a freeway coming through their beautiful neighborhood. And so they spent approximately the next 40 years fighting this. Finally, in 2017, 18, somewhere around there, state of California gave up its fight. That's a perfect example of a defended neighborhood. These wealthy people had enough money to pool their money to create a nonprofit organization so they could fund their legal fight and hire some of the best lawyers. If you want to find out more information about that, look up the 710 extension and South Pasadena. Just do a Google search for that and it'll bring up lots of information. All right, so thinking about the different types of people and the kinds of neighborhoods they live in. Wealthy. Wealthy people tend to live in exclusive areas. They may live in gated communities. They may live in communities that are further from the freeway, harder to get to, and of course, much more expensive places to live. The housing is more expensive, the restaurants are more expensive, the stores are selling the same products as middle class areas but more expensive. Um, and so, I mean, just think about it this way. Whole Foods is not in every community. You won't find a Whole Foods on the east side of LA or out in the San Fernando Valley in Pacoima or areas like that, but you will find that Whole Foods in places like Glendale or Beverly Hills or Pasadena, etc. These are people who typically have conspicuous consumption. They drive really nice cars and wear nice clothes and have the most expensive jewelry and watches. In short, they want people to know that they have disposable income. The creative class. This is a class of people, and it doesn't mean just people that are engaged in creating art, but it's really focused on people who create things. Uh, think about it this way. If you have an Apple product, look at the back of it. It says, created in California, made in China. The idea of the iPhone was created in California, in Silicon Valley, but it's manufactured somewhere else. People who created all these social media platforms, from Facebook to TikTok to Instagram to WhatsApp, etc. People who create all these different apps that enable us to use these ride sharing services. These are creative people. They have an idea, and we don't maybe know that we needed it until they create it, and then it becomes quite popular. 15 years ago, who thought of, or even, let's see, it's 12 years ago, even in 2010, who thought about a ride sharing app? Who thought about sharing rides? Who thought about taking a ride from somebody who was just driving their car and picking people up for a fee? No, people took taxis. It wasn't even on anybody's radar to ride share. And now so many of us do it. I can't remember the last time I took a taxi. Even I'm traveling in other countries. Most places have Uber uh, and sometimes even Lyft, or they have their own version, their own local version of those ride sharing services. Of course, these people tend to prefer a more diverse, tolerant type of community. These people also typically would like to have very diverse kinds of food and entertainment options available to them. And so these are typically what are viewed as the drivers of gentrification and neighborhood change. So these are people who buy up houses for much cheaper than they would buy them in the wealthy area. They fix them up, and lo and behold, somebody else comes and buys a home for under market and fixes that up, and slowly they start changing the neighborhood, which then means others come in to provide services for these people. Coffee shops begin to spring up, art galleries, restaurants, etc. The suburban middle class, these are people who don't want to live in a city. And we started seeing this in the late 1960s, and that's when the term white flight was coined by sociologists. Um, as people of color had more housing opportunities, more job opportunities because of the civil rights movement, because of anti-discrimination laws, they were able to then live in white areas. Well, whites didn't particularly like that so much. Many of those who had the ability, they moved out and they moved to the suburbs where housing was cheaper and they could have more land, bigger backyard. And of course, tax money was used in these suburban areas to create the public facilities needed. Public golf courses, swimming pools, tennis courts, parks, public marinas, libraries, all of these things. Paid vacations and leisure time certainly traditionally have been more widely available to people in this social class. However, today it is the case that for many people in the middle class, uh, even though they may have vacation time that is paid, they often don't take it. Apparently, a large percentage of Americans who have vacation time don't take it. They feel like they don't have time for leisure. And then the working class, the working poor, people who are jobless, these people tend to live in areas of a city that are um, more rundown. They may be living in temporary housing, such as trailer parks or manufactured homes. They may be homeless. They may be sharing housing with another family or two or three roommates, etc. And as these spaces, these geographic spaces become more and more run down, then retail shops, diners, bars, restaurants have less and less of an incentive to stay there. And so they may begin to close, and no other shopkeeper comes in to replace them. And then finally, the ethnic enclaves. Ethnic neighborhoods. Lots of different ethnic neighborhoods have existed. Almost every major city has a Chinatown. Um, I can't think of one major city I've been to that didn't have a Chinatown. Um, I don't know if they call them Mexican neighborhoods so much anymore, because I would think of them more as just Latinx neighborhoods, because there's so much integration with people of Mexican ancestry and Central American ancestry in many what we previously called Mexican neighborhoods. On the East Coast, common to have Irish neighborhoods, Greek neighborhoods. In LA, I know that we've got our Little Armenia, we've got Little Saigon down in Orange County, we've got Thai Town in Hollywood. So all these different areas where a number of people who share a similar ethnic identity live. An ethnic enclave, a true ethnic enclave, is one in which you could go to that space and you could almost believe you were in the capital of that country. So El Mercadito is a place in East LA that if you go to it, you could almost imagine you're someplace in Mexico City, because all the vendors speak Spanish, all the vendors are selling Mexican products or items that cater to people of Mexican ancestry. The restaurants or the little food stands there are serving Mexican food, quote, authentic Mexican food, and it really is, because the people making it are of Mexican ancestry, versus when you go to, I don't know, some Italian restaurants that are supposedly authentic, it's a bunch of brown people in the back cooking, or Chinese restaurants that are authentic, it's a bunch of brown people cooking in the back. So, of course, there are probably, as you might, well, there are, as you know, or might have guessed, there are some pros and cons to ethnic enclaves. One of the positive things about ethnic enclaves is that these ethnic enclaves provide a welcoming space for new immigrants, a social network, people who can teach this person about how to live in the U.S., because it is very different from where they came from. It can be a source of help finding housing, finding a job, finding a place to take your children to the park, etc. One of the negative things, of course, is that if there's so much concentration and isolation within the ethnic enclave, then people may not have any incentive to perhaps learn English or want to become a citizen so that they can then vote. They may be so comfortable in that cocoon of their community that they do not have the opportunity to experience all of the wonderful things that their new city has. It's the end of the chapter. See you for the chapter 10 overview next week.